We go. All right. Well, good afternoon and welcome, everyone. And I would like to thank you for joining us for today's presentation by Amy Erica Smith, Liberal Arts and Sciences Dean's Professor, Associate Professor of Political Science at the ISU, and who will be speaking to us today on Wither Democracy in Brazil and Venezuela. I am Sandra Morrow, ICFRC board member and host for today's program. I would like to take a moment to thank our members, volunteers, and interns for making these programs possible. I want to also acknowledge our university and community supporters, the University of Iowa's international programs, the University of Iowa's honors program, this University of Iowa Public Policy Center, and the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization for their financial support. And I also want to thank today's special sponsors, Karen and Wallace Chapel, Alice and Ken Atkinson, and Mason K. Braverman. I also want to thank City Channel 4 for professionally recording our programs for cablecast on City Channel 4 or 118-2, and the UI Library's digital archives. Please be sure to like City Channel 4 on Facebook. Now, our format today is the usual one. Following our speaker's presentation at about 1 p.m., we will have a 15-minute Q&A with written questions submitted by audience members. Please note that we do request that the questions be submitted in writing because questions from the floor, City Channel 4 has a hard time catching. So if you could write your questions on the cards that are provided at your table, our interns will pick them up at the conclusion of the speaker's remarks. At this time, please go ahead and silence your cell phones and electronic devices. And I also would ask that if you have to leave early, please do so quietly and without disturbing others. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Amy Erica Smith. Amy Erica Smith is an associate professor of political science and liberal arts and sciences dean's professor at Iowa State University. It's a long
It's a mouthful, yes.
Sorry. Her research examines politics at the citizen level. She investigates how people around the world understand, interact with, and shape their democratic and authoritarian regimes, and how civic and religious groups and ideas mobilize them. Regionally, her primary expertise is in Latin America, and particularly Brazil. Over the past few years, she has also engaged in 2 projects studying the intersection of gender and academia. Smith's books include Religion and Brazilian Democracy, Mobilizing the People of God, and her articles have appeared or are forthcoming in a number of peer-reviewed outlets. She is on the editorial board of Politics and Religion, and an associate editor of the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Religion and Politics. She is also a proud member of the Latin American Public Opinion Project family. In September 2016, she received the award for Early Achievement in Research from the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Iowa State. In the 2019 and 2020 academic year, Smith is the Luce and ACLS Fellow in Journalism, Religion, and International Affairs, as well as a Wilson Center Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Please join me in welcoming Amy Erica Smith.
Thank you, Sandra. Sorry. That was quite a mouthful for the biography. Thank you. Well, thank you, guys. I'm delighted to be here. And I didn't know I was going to get to be on cable TV. That's pretty cool. Hi. Okay, so I'm delighted to be here. I come as an emissary from the nation of Silandia to Iowa City. Our people are kind and gentle people. While they have been in rivalry with your people for many years, and we will have a ceremonial battle. We will have a ceremonial ritual battle this coming Saturday on my home territory. We hold you no ill will, and I am here to represent my people. Okay, so I'm here today to talk to you about Venezuela and Brazil. The two countries, or two of the countries that are most commonly in the news right now with respect to South American politics. These are countries, there's been a lot of buzz in the media about authoritarianism and democracy in these two countries. So I'm going to talk us through today how we evaluate the extent to which these countries are democratic or authoritarian, and they vary substantially in the extent to which they're democratic or authoritarian. So how we evaluate whether they're democratic or authoritarian. In the process, I'm going to talk with you about what's happening in the two countries. And we'll talk a little bit about how we got here, what led us to this weird point in time in both countries, crises of varying levels and of severity in the two countries, and speculate a little bit on what will happen in the future. We will see what will happen. I don't like prognosticating. I'm always wary of making predictions for the future, but there are some things we can say about what's going to happen in the two countries and some general guesses about the optimism for democracy or pessimism for a democracy in the two countries. Okay, so, and we've heard a lot about authoritarianism in the news. All right, so on the Brazilian side, we've got this guy as president. So this guy is Jair Bolsonaro. I'll talk to you about his really interesting biography in a second. He's 64 years old, former military man, sometimes evangelical. He actually is affiliated with both Catholicism and evangelicalism in a really complicated and interesting way. Generally called a far-rightist politician. Jair Bolsonaro, one of the things that he's known for in Brazilian politics is making the guns sign. So in Brazilian political culture, or just culture in general, the gun sign is less common than I think it is here in the United States, and it's taken sort of as a sign of hostility. But he really likes guns and has been responsible for a movement to try to liberalize gun rights in Brazil, which had been a minority position for pretty much all of Brazilian history, or all of the history of the most recent democratic period up until fairly recently. So we've got on the Brazilian side, we've got this guy as president. When he ran for office in 2018, the way you may have heard of him the most was for there were articles all over the news with the scandalous things Jair Bolsonaro had said. Among the scandalous things that he had said, so this actually was trumpeted, I think, almost more in American media than it was in Brazilian media, though it was certainly talked about in Brazilian media too, but people already knew about it in Brazilian media. So among the scandalous things he said are, for instance, to a federal female deputy, I wouldn't rape you, you don't deserve it. Well, yeah, it's she doesn't deserve to be raped because she's very ugly. She's not my type, I'd never rape her. He's recently there's been this kind of insidious or uncomfortable back and forth between various politicians in his government about how ugly Emmanuel Macron's wife, Brigitte Macron, is. So this is the kind of person. So they've been, Bolsonaro called her ugly, and then his economics minister was like, in a public forum, was asked about it, and he was like, well, yeah, I mean, she's ugly. What are you gonna? So this is the kind of guy we're talking about. He's also said things about women. I wouldn't employ women and men with the same salary. But there are a lot of competent women. I just wouldn't pay them the same salary. He's come out as an apologist for the dictatorship that ruled the country from 1964 to 1985. Said the dictatorship's mistake was to torture but not to kill. He said that they should have killed more people, etc. He dedicated his vote. He voted for the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, the former president, in 2016, as did the overwhelming majority of members of both the Chamber of Deputies, that is the lower Chamber of Commerce, and the Senate. But when he voted, he dedicated his vote to the memory of the torturer general, the general who had been involved in torture, and Dilma Rousseff herself had been tortured by the military. So this was seen as a particularly vicious affront to Dilma Rousseff. He's come out for anti-gay statements, potentially racist statements. So this is the guy who is now president of Brazil. His biography is really very interesting, and I think has gotten less attention in international media, but I think is one of the most interesting things about him. He got involved in politics as a low-level officer in the army. So he became interested in the army towards the end of the dictatorship period as a young man, as a teenager, basically, and he started to sort of volunteer to help the army. And then as soon as he was able to enlist, as soon as he was old enough to enlist, he enlisted and became a low-ranking officer, went to officers' training school, and made a political name for himself by staging a minor terroristic campaign against a minor act of terrorism, or attempting to stage a minor act of terrorism against the military. So he was upset about the salaries, as were many military men at the end of the dictatorship or at the beginning of the new democracy. It was a period of hyperinflation and very poor economic performance. Salaries in the military were taking a hit. He was really upset about it, and wrote an op-ed about how he was upset about it, and then ended up getting interviewed by a reporter from a major national magazine, Veja, and confessed in the interview, told the reporter about his plot to set off bombs in barracks and a bathroom in Brazil, or on the army base. And so he tells the reporter the story, and she goes back and tells her boss, these guys have just told me about how they're going to set off bombs in the barracks and the bathrooms at the army base. What do I do about this? And her boss says, well, I know he told you it was off the record, but you can't actually confess to those kinds of things off the record. So the boss proceeds immediately to publish the diagram of how they're going to set off the bombs on the army base. So he starts the procedure. The army starts the procedure for a dishonorable discharge, not surprisingly. He arouses such popular support that he, from other military men, that they end up sort of letting him off the hook on a technicality. They say that they can't prove that it was him, even though it's really, really obvious that it was him. So they basically let him off the hook, and he enters politics as running for city council in Rio, where he was living at the time. So that's how he got his start in politics. So that's the kind of person we're talking about. Yeah, so that's his. This right here is the diagram of. He draws out the diagram for the Veja reporter, who proceeds immediately to publish the diagram that he has given her off the record. Yeah. So, okay, and on the Venezuelan side, we have Nicolás Maduro, who is a former bus driver who came up through the ranks working for Hugo Chavez. Hugo Chavez. So Nicolás Maduro has been president of Venezuela since shortly after the death of Hugo Chavez in 2013. Hugo Chavez was had been president of Venezuela since 1999. So Nicolás Maduro is widely recognized, or at least when he took over, he was certainly widely recognized as not being nearly as charismatic or nearly as good a politician as his predecessor and mentor, Hugo Chavez. But he has managed, despite his widely trumpeted lack of charisma, to hang on to power very, very, very effectively, and to sort of manipulate things behind the scenes to prevent military coups, even in the face of really abysmal economic performance. Abysmal isn't even the word for it. What's worse than abysmal? Yeah. So sorry. Catastrophic, yes, catastrophic. It is indeed catastrophic economic performance. So this is President of Venezuela, whose mentor, Hugo Chavez, has a similar story for entry into politics as, interestingly, as Jair Bolsonaro's story. So Hugo Chavez's story for his entry into politics is staging a coup, an attempted coup, in 1992. So we have very similar stories of military men rising through the ranks, low-level military men who engage in in authoritarian or disorderly conduct within the military. So Hugo Chavez tries to stage a coup in 1992, is foiled, and as part of the terms of his surrender, he says to the military, okay, well, I'll turn myself in, I'll go to jail, it's not a problem, but let me say a few words on TV. And they're like, okay, sure, whatever, you can say a few words on TV. So he gets on TV, and he is incredibly charismatic. He is very, very good at TV. He was just an extraordinarily good public speaker, and just like, it was like he was made for TV cameras. And the short speech that he gives on TV was enough to get him sort of almost a cult-like following, a very strong following. So he does his time in prison and then emerges as a politician, and ends up running for office and winning, and became president in 1999. Okay, so because of my our various technical issues today, I have only 15 minutes left to talk. So I'm going to think about how I'm going to abridge the talk. So the questions that I want to talk with you guys about today are: what's happening, how did we get here, and where are we headed? But first, I want to talk a little bit about what democracy is. So the talk was billed as being about democracy in South America. So I think you guys have speakers from a wide range of academic disciplines here. And I don't know if you've had other speakers who've come in to talk with you guys about how political scientists think about democracy, but you have had other speakers come in to talk with you guys about how political scientists think about democracy. So I'm going to give you like a 5-minute introduction to comparative politics overview of how political scientists think about democracy. So, democracy. What is democracy? It's common when in the United States to hear people say things like, we're not a democracy, we're a republic, which is something that people often learn in high school civics classes. The truth is that when you get into to the academic level, to the sort of to the university level, when academics talk about democracy, we are usually talking about what many of you may have learned in high school civics classes called a republic. So the notion of democracy the root words of democracy are demos plus kratos. Demos meaning the people, kratos meaning rule by. So the root word, so democracy literally etymologically means rule by the people. And the sort of the prototypical democracy that we're used to thinking about is Athenian democracy, which would be an assembly in which everybody who's able comes and participates in an open forum in which anybody can talk. There are effectively no career politicians. There may be people who are informally career politicians, but there aren't effectively leaders. Everybody is supposed to be equal, and we all participate together in a forum. That obviously doesn't work in a country the size of the United States or Venezuela or Brazil. And in modern times, we don't. When political scientists talk about democracy, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about countries where we have elections. So when political scientists, we've written thousands and thousands of books probably about democracy. When political scientists talk about democracy, first of all, we're talking about elections. We're talking about free and fair elections. Free and fair are two terms that are not taken for granted. So free and fair elections for the highest executive office. So a country's a democracy when it has free and fair elections for the highest executive office. And those elections are expected to be able to result in turnover of power, even if they don't necessarily always result in turnover of power. When we talk about democracy, though, political scientists also often add in other things. The sort of baseline level of what we mean when we talk about democracy is that there are free and fair elections for the highest executive office, but we also often add on adjectives to democracy to talk about other forms of democracy. And I'm going to talk a lot about liberal democracy. Liberal not meaning like Democrat with a big D. Not meaning liberal in the American politics sense, but liberal meaning referring to liberty. So a democracy focused on liberty, what we call liberal democracy, is a democracy where not only do we have free and fair elections, but there are protections for the civil rights and civil liberties of citizens. There is an attempt to ensure that every citizen effectively gets a voice. Oh, and the other thing I didn't say about elections is that we need universal suffrage or something close to universal suffrage for it to count as a democracy. Okay, using this standard, we're going to talk through whether or not Venezuela and Brazil can be considered democracies, and to what extent can they regain democracy if we're not there yet, if we're not there now. Okay, so why should we care about democracy? I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this, so I could probably give you an entire lecture on this. But there are lots of reasons we should care about democracy. So if we care about the basic survival of human beings in the world, we need to care about democracy, because democracy is the best way to ensure people adequate There are individual interventions that we can engage in, but at a systematic level, democracy is one of the most important institutions that can guarantee people, or can help to get people nutrition, can help to get people voice, can help to get people the agency to be able to participate in their political system and to be able to decide their own their own life and their own destiny. So we need to care about democracy if we care about people being able to do the basic things that they need to do in the world. Democracy helps to promote all of those things. Democracy is not a cure and is not a silver bullet, but it can help. Okay, so democracy in Latin America and the world. I put a wave up here because democracy, one of the things that political scientists know about democracy and the lack of democracy, which we call authoritarianism, one of the things political scientists know about democracy and authoritarianism is that these both move in waves around the world. Across the globe, we had a wave of democratization, that is, movement of which one country after another moved towards democracy, that we call the third wave of democratization because there's a history of waves of democracy spreading across the world. So the most recent wave of democratization happened across the world, and especially in the developing world, in the global south, and particularly in Latin America, beginning in the mid-1970s and lasting, depending on how you count it, probably through Mexico's democratization around 2000. So it was a long wave of democracy, but there were a whole bunch of countries that all transitioned to democracy in pretty much in the 1980s was when the largest period of the most number of countries transitioned to democracy. So democracy moves in waves, and Latin America has had a big wave of democracy that resulted in most of the countries in the region becoming democratic. Most of the countries in the region had been undemocratic. Actually, Venezuela was an exception to this rule, but most of the countries had been undemocratic in the 1960s and early 1970s, and by 1990, most of the countries in the region were democracies, and a few remaining ones turned democratic between 1990 and 2000. And now we are in a global wave of authoritarianism, or what some people are calling autocratization, which is an uncomfortable word that doesn't roll off the tongue, but I think it is actually an effective word in describing what is happening. That countries are moving gradually towards becoming autocracies, one after another, in the same way that we had one country after another increase in level of democracy for about 20 good years there. We are now having one country after another become, if not full-scale authoritarian regimes, less democratic than they were. And we see, and Venezuela and Brazil, as we will see, are two examples of this movement, though to very, very different degrees. Okay. I'm going to talk just a little bit about what's happening, and then I'm not going to be able to finish the rest of my notes, and we can talk about these in question and answer. Okay, so what's happening in these two countries? All right, so we can't talk about politics without talking about the economy first. And particularly in the case of Venezuela, where the economy, you hear a lot about economics and politics in Venezuela, and it's hard to disentangle these two. But as a political scientist, I'm going to tell you that the economy is the thing that is the biggest problem in Venezuela, even more so than democracy. Democracy is hurting the economy, or the lack of democracy. That politics is hurting the economy, but the single biggest human rights problem in Venezuela right now is the economy. So we've got inflation that at this point cannot really be measured. It is... I actually didn't download the most recent numbers, but we're talking tens of thousands of percentage a year. We're talking like every day in markets, prices are in goods in in marketplaces are being repriced every day, continually on an ongoing basis. So you start off the morning with a certain amount of money, and by the end of the day, your money is worth less than it was at the beginning of the day. So we have extreme levels of inflation, extreme scarcity of goods, extreme malnutrition, and politics is contributing to that, but the biggest problem is the economy. In Brazil, we have nothing like the economic meltdown of Venezuela, but we do have had, Brazil was in a recession for a couple of years in 2015, 2016, has emerged from recession, but has had a very bumpy economic rebound, such as it is. There was great hope that Jair Bolsonaro and his economics minister, who is much loved by finance types, that Jair Bolsonaro and his finance minister were going to be able to jumpstart the economy and get things going again, and it has not happened yet. And they keep revising downward the economic forecasts. So the most recent news is they were hoping for economic for growth over 2%. That's definitely going to be under 2% in 2019 and perhaps in 2020 as well. So the situation, and we can't talk about Venezuela without talking about the refugees. So we have a situation in Venezuela where we have the dramatic economic meltdown is leading to an exodus of Venezuelans, at least 4 million. It's very hard to count. In the same way it's hard to count inflation, it's also hard to count refugees right now coming out of Venezuela. But the numbers that are generally used are around 4 million out of Venezuela, and it's growing daily. Extraordinarily, the neighboring countries around Venezuela have been, by and large, very welcoming, or unusually welcoming. There have been problems, and there are issues, and there have been attempts at times to restrict the number of Venezuelan refugees, but by and large, neighboring countries have been quite welcoming of Venezuelan refugees. Okay. On the political front, again, we have greatly differing levels of dysfunction. We have dueling presidents in Venezuela. So we have here Nicolás Maduro. The guy here on the bottom is the one who actually holds power, who actually controls the military, actually controls what's happening in most of the entities of government. The guy here up at the top, Juan Guaidó, is, some people call it self-appointed. Some people would say appointed by others, but he has claimed the mantle of democratic legitimacy and calls himself the rightful president of Venezuela, which he has some claim to on the basis of the argument that Nicolás Maduro was not democratically elected in the most recent election. So in 2007, yeah, so we in the most recent democratic election in 2018, we did have he staged an election, but the election was widely trumpeted as not being free and fair. And so on this basis, Nicolás Maduro, who is the president of the National Assembly, that is to say, effectively the president of Congress, he claims to be the rightful president of Brazil because he was democratically elected. So we've got two presidents in Venezuela, one president in Brazil. Brazil wins on that front. People know who the president is. We also have greatly differing levels of function in the relationship between chambers of Congress, or the Congress and the presidency in Brazil and Venezuela. So on the left-hand side, we see Juan Guaidó, who is the self-appointed or other appointed president of Brazil, who is also, or president of Venezuela, who is in deadlock with Nicolás Maduro over who's going to be president. So we have the presidency and the legislature fighting each other for which one is the democratic, legitimate entity that can hold power in Venezuela. Whereas here on the right-hand side, we have Rodrigo Maia, who is the president of the Chamber of Deputies in Brazil. He is not an international figure in the same way that Juan Guaidó is. So Juan Guaidó is made himself something of a statesman, and that he is traveling the world telling people that he's the president of Venezuela, and many people, including the United States, many countries, including the United States and most of the countries of South America, recognize him as the legitimate president. Rodrigo Maia is just some politician in Brazil that you wouldn't know about necessarily unless you're a Brazilian. But the fact that Rodrigo Maia has been, in many cases, been opposing Bolsonaro, but we have more of a normal functioning of Congress opposing the president in a more normal kind of gridlock fashion. So we have varying levels of dysfunction in the two countries. Okay, so is this democracy? And I think I'm going to have to cut myself off here after I answer this question because we're running so far behind. Okay, so is this democracy? In the Venezuelan case, it's very clear that what is happening is not democratic. So sometime around the end of Hugo Chavez's rule is when most people are term in office. He died in 2013 from cancer. So sometime around the end of around 2010, the late 2000s is when most Latin Americanists, most political scientists would date the end of Brazilian or Venezuelan democracy. In Venezuela, it's very clear that the country is no longer a democratic regime, and that the country is only becoming more and more authoritarian, in that elections are clearly neither free nor fair. There is no doubt that parties have been prohibited from running for office. So most opposition parties are prohibited from running for office. Many opposition politicians have been prohibited from running for office, from running candidacies. And we've had a breakdown of democracy that's really very severe. Where is this going in the future? Where is the Venezuelan case going in the future? We have right now, we've been in a situation that seems that it can't continue for years now in Venezuela, and yet it keeps continuing. And yet, especially with the appointment with Nicolás Maduro's self-proclamation as president of Venezuela, we have had increasing movement on the international sphere to try to negotiate an end to this. So there are negotiations ongoing. They stop. They start. But there have been progressive negotiations between Guaidó's team and Maduro's team in Venezuela over the end to democracy. It seems that most experts right now believe that negotiation is the answer to the problem, or that if there is an answer, it has to be through negotiation, because it's going to be very hard to get Nicolás Maduro out of power apart from through negotiation. Venezuela has some extreme assets in terms of movement towards democracy. So Venezuela has a robust, active civil society, many civil society organizations, a highly educated citizenry that is really very committed to civil rights. And there are many organizations doing good work and media organizations doing good work promoting freedom of information in an extremely difficult context. And then we have international attention turned to it right now. So to the extent that the international community can work together to encourage negotiation and compromise to the end, will be the best way to convince, to get Nicolás Maduro to remove himself from power voluntarily. The other entity that I haven't talked about really very much right now is the military, which is propping Maduro up, and this negotiation very much needs to, and I think is, including the military in the discussion of how to get Maduro out of power. Okay, so Brazil. Brazil is not in a meltdown in the same way that Venezuela is. So we have here political scientists who have been made some really alarmist statements about how Jair Bolsonaro's presidency could be the end of democracy in Brazil. About a year ago or so, people were saying things like, this is an extremely radical shift. It's a danger to democracy in Brazil. So top political scientists from Harvard were saying that Jair Bolsonaro could mean the end of democracy in Brazil. It appears that Jair Bolsonaro's presidency has not necessarily meant the end of democracy in Brazil. Brazil keeps limping along as a low-quality democracy. People like this guy, Rodrigo Maia, have become unlikely heroes of maintaining Brazilian democracy. Rodrigo Maia is not a sort of democratic hero kind of a guy, but he is standing up for his rights within Congress. The Brazilian Supreme Court is effectively opposing things that Bolsonaro wants to do. So other institutions in Brazil are continuing to support democracy and to pose effective resistance in Brazil. Okay. I am going to cut myself off there because I think I've already gone over time and I need to give you guys time for questions.
All right. So first question. Do we have free and fair elections for the highest executive office here in the U.S. with universal suffrage?
Okay, so my first instinct was to just say pass, but, and I'm a Latin Americanist and I can't talk about American politics. But more seriously, I'm going to say yes. Political scientists, and so there's been this survey called Brightline Watch that's been going on in the United States for about 2.5 years that has been surveying political scientists and ordinary citizens. Political scientists tend to be much more optimistic about the state of U.S. democracy than do citizens. And that if you look particularly at the institutional form of American democracy does have some problems. There are problems with American democracy. There are issues, and the level of democracy, there are rating entities that rate level of democracy of countries around the world, and the U.S.'s level is declining based on some of the issues that you guys are thinking about. That said, the U.S. continues to be a strong, robust democracy by the standards that I have laid out, by the standards political scientists use.
All right. Historically, what is the length of political waves?
That's a great question. What is the length? So the question: how long does a wave of democracy last, or a wave of authoritarianism last? I don't have a good answer for it. The first wave of democratization. So the guy who laid out this theory that democracy moves in waves, which has been empirically documented over and over again since this. But the first guy who laid out the theory dated the first wave of democracy to the late 1800s. The truth is that the first wave of democracy probably began with the establishment of the United States as something that at the time was called a democracy, but that would not be called a democracy today in 1776. So the first wave of democracy was really very long and lasted up until shortly before the First World War, or around the time of the First World War. The third wave of democracy, by contrast, lasted a couple of decades. So we don't have a good answer to this question. I don't know that there is any particular science about when they end. We do know that countries' democratization, when one country democratizes, it influences its neighbor, which also tends to move towards democracy. When one country becomes authoritarian, and especially when major powerful countries become more authoritarian, including the United States and China, when countries like the US, China, and Russia all simultaneously become more authoritarian, even though the U.S. is still a democracy, but the U.S. has decreased in its level of democracy, those things also have ripple effects that influence countries that look towards countries like the U.S., Russia, and China.
How has the economic and political crisis in Venezuela affected international tourism? And same question for Brazil.
Okay, tourism in Venezuela. I would not go to Venezuela as a tourist right now. I don't know. I have not heard anybody talking about tourism in Venezuela for a while, and I cannot tell you what's going on in terms of tourism in Venezuela. I don't think many people go to Venezuela as tourists right now. I don't have the numbers on it, but yeah, I don't think it's high. I don't think Venezuela is a going location for tourism right now. Tourism in Brazil. So I just saw a headline today, I think it was maybe in the news yesterday, and I saw it this morning in the news that tourism is down 5% in Brazil right now. It's not clear what's driving that decline. It could be, there is speculation, particularly among opponents to Bolsonaro in Brazil. I have seen people speculating about how Bolsonaro's policies are leading to a decline in tourism. It's not clear to me that that's necessarily the case. It could be that the economy is poor, which is leading to a decline in tourism. But it might be that Bolsonaro's rhetoric, I mean, people who say the kinds of things that I had up here, people who say those kinds of things may, if somebody's saying things like about raping women, if the president's saying things about raping women, perhaps it does have an effect on whether tourists want to visit the country or not. So it is possible that Bolsonaro himself or his sort of brand of politics might be driving some of the decline in tourism.
What, in theory, will the military need in Venezuela to stand down on supporting Maduro?
Oh my gosh. If I could give a good answer to that, you should probably fly me to negotiations in Norway or Cuba. What will the military need to stand down? I cannot tell you completely. I can tell you a little bit about what's propping up military support for him, which gets us to thinking about what could help to undermine military support for him. What appears to be propping up military support is, I would say, two things. One is ideology, that there are many members of the military who were put into them, especially in the higher ranks in the military, people who were put in place as strong partisans of Hugo Chavez, and who very strongly really believe in Hugo Chavez's political program, which was sort of an extreme left wing, at least ideologically, not necessarily in practice, but ideologically extremely left-wing vision for Venezuelan society. And so there are many members of the military who actually are Chavistas to their core, and how you convince them to leave power, there may be ways to convince them that current Chavismo is not for fulfilling the ideals of Chavismo. And there is a lot of discussion of this right now among Chavista, sort of more moderate Chavista circles in Venezuela, is that, yeah, I'm a Chavista, but I didn't sign up for this kind of Chavismo. But then the other thing is co-optation, that they, which is to say that the military many members of the military are doing well financially from Venezuela's meltdown, which is in part because they're engaged in criminal businesses. There's lots and lots of really good research out there being done right now on the military ties to criminal businesses. So the military has effectively become something of a smuggling organization. So they're getting rich off it. And just as importantly, they will, if they hand themselves in, be subject to prosecution by any future regime. So how to get them out, how to change the cycle. You can promise often in a transition to democracy, you see the people who are the pro-democracy side promising the military immunity from prosecution in order to get the military to leave power. That is one, a difficult to implement promise, because 10 years from now, you can't really promise that some future democratic regime is going to respect it. And I mean, so it's hard to enforce internally, and it's hard to enforce externally. They can't promise that the U.S. won't prosecute, for instance. So these are the things that are keeping the military engaged. And it's hard to see how to undermine it, though I know many people, smart people are working on this.
All right, so we're just about nearing the end, probably a little over, but there was one last question that I think we can probably get in. So what is your prediction for the score on Saturday's game?
Oh my gosh, I can predict the future of Brazil and Venezuela, but I am not going to make a prediction for Saturday's game. I am a political scientist and not a football scholar. Sorry.
All right. Well, then, thank you so much. That concludes our program. I want to give a big thank you to Amy Erica Smith for the wonderful presentation. I also want to thank our sponsors, the University of Iowa's International Programs, the University of Iowa's Honors Program, the University of Iowa Public Policy Center, and the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization for their generous support. And we also would like to thank our special sponsors for the day, Karen and Wallace Chapel, Alice and Ken Atkinson, and Mace and Kay Braverman. And we thank City Channel 4 for making our programs available for the viewing audiences. Now, Erica, as a small token of our appreciation, I would like to present you with the highly coveted Iowa City Foreign Relations Council mug. Thank you for joining us, everyone, and we are adjourned for the day.